Hey guys, so this Stargate is by far the most comprehensive, complex build I've made to date. Made primarily from cereal box card, it really was an achievement, I feel. One of the coolest things I'm really pleased with is I've managed to get it so that this actual central disc rotates, which looks pretty damn cool. The wormhole also detaches from the whole ring itself, so you can take this piece off if you wish. This lights up, these light up. So how cool is that? Tell you what, let's do this. I'm going to use chipboard for the major part of the Stargate build because I want the gate to actually be able to revolve as it should or does in the films and the TV series. So for that I'm going to use chipboard, which is a pretty durable material. So here I'm just cutting out the various interlocking circles that will form the revolving part of the gate itself. I sandwiched together two of those circles so that they form a nice solid inner ring, and then I also wanted a recessed or rebaited ring within that, and so I just glue a single piece of chipboard as cut from those interlocking circles. I had a really curious phenomena here, and some of you may just spot it on the video there, and that is using the super glue on chipboard was making the chipboard smoke. If anybody can tell me why that might be happening, I would be really appreciative. So I definitely put my mask on for this. I did a Google search for Stargate diagrams. I wish I could credit the original artist. I did look, but I could not find who had done this piece of artwork. If you think it's yours, please drop me a bell and I will certainly put a credit in the video. So I used this as my master for the going forward design elements. So I glued that to my main circle, the inner ring that will rotate, and from that I could then cut various pieces of cereal box card to create the surface details. To make the chevrons easier to cut out, I had printed those onto a thin white art card, and then it was just a process of going around slicing them out of the artwork, the line work, and sticking them to the inner ring. These thin card surface details are going to add a lot of dynamic to the final paint job, although they won't necessarily be standing out right now. So it's time to start trying out my idea for how to make this inner ring be able to revolve within the actual build. And so to do that, what I'm actually looking to create is a kind of tray that the ring will sit into. So I cut a circle that is a little larger than the circle of the ring itself, and then I attached a thin piece of card in a vertical orientation to that tray that I'm cutting out, and that allowed a recess for the inner ring to sit into. That would then be sandwiched with another piece of card on top, enclosing the whole ring. I am so pleased with how the turn mechanism has worked out on this. It adding that sleeve around the outer edge has really paid off, and I can get that turn now. So I've got to add another sleeve to this this still, because the lights have got to be fit onto here. So yeah, so this is the LED wire which will wrap around this outer edge now, and that's so that I can glue it to that without it affecting this, and that's the whole point of this inner sleeve before I put the detail sleeve on. So there we go. Anyway, I'm really pleased with that. I hope you can see how that turns now. So with another 2 circles of cereal box card cut, I can then attach those, which will form the channel into which I can then start gluing the LED wire. I use short lengths of cereal box card spaced evenly around the channel so that it would leave gaps for the light to shine through where I needed it to shine through on the chevron markers. In hindsight, I would now use full LEDs rather than LED wire. The LED wire doesn't actually produce enough light for my personal taste in the final build. However, it works out well enough. I won't lie, the vast amount of surface detailing that went into this was a great number of hours, and the reason why there was a bit of a gap with me releasing any videos. This project wasn't intended to be quite as lengthy as it was, but it was these details, cutting out tiny pieces of card to place over both sides of the concentric rings, took an awful lot of time and an awful lot of patience. And I'm not going to document every single one of those stages, but just suffice to say that the more of this particular aspect you can apply, the better that finished terrain piece is going to look. To create the 7 glowing crystals around the ring, I'm using a plastic cordial bottle. It's readily accessible, it's very easy to mark up on, and is also very easy to cut, so it was a simple option to take. And I took a relatively fine grit sandpaper to sand that plastic with to diffuse the light. And then, as I said previously, it's a lot of rinse and repeat of the same thing and just keep going. You need a lot of patience for this kind of terrain build. Just to the left there, you can also see the actual structure upon which the Stargate is going to sit. That's coming up shortly in the video. initial reason for this build was my entry into the Encounter Terrain 10x10 competition, which requires it to stand on a 10cm by 10cm base. Now, I was going to easily overshoot the deadline, so in the end I decided not to go with the 10x10cm base and instead expanded out for something more elaborate that may be more interactive in my D&D game that I'm hoping to put this into. Not that I'm letting my characters travel to different planets necessarily, although that may well be an option. There are a number of planets within the crystal spheres, and I've also kind of been keen on maybe a Spelljammer campaign at some point. So, hey, who knows? However, all that said, the actual function of the base was to hold 2 battery packs. The reason for 2 battery packs is because I've got 2 separate pieces of lighting that I want to incorporate into this Stargate. The orange crystals that light up around the ring of the Stargate itself. But I also want to be able to light up the explosion of the wormhole liquid when the gate first opens, or what might be in our D&D game, the phlogiston, as it burst out through the Stargate itself. Trying to figure out how I was going to access these battery packs once the base structure was enclosed became a bit of a chore, and ultimately, because I was now past the deadline date for the competition, that's when I decided to change my idea, make the battery packs more accessible and build out a larger base for the Stargate to stand on using EVA foam. The build for this base really was just done as I went, just letting it develop as I saw fit. There was no intentional plan before starting, other than the fact I needed it to hold these 2 battery packs. And I took a leaf out of the Tabletop Witchcraft channel and just used magnets to hold those in place, and that has worked out very well. It's one of my first times using magnets. I'd have probably used bigger magnets maybe, but they worked perfectly well. So once I'd got the big shape sorted for this base, I started to think about some of the finer details and some of the symbolism that I wanted to include. And obviously the Stargate was heavily influenced by Egyptian architecture in the films and the TV series, and I like the idea that you would have to kneel in supplication to the gods to be able to approach this portal. And I remembered climbing a pyramid in Mexico once, admittedly not Egyptian, but the experience was that you had to literally use your hands and your feet because the steps were so narrow and so steep. So this played into the design aesthetic that I'd got for these very narrow steps rising up very sharply to the entrance into the gateway. I wanted to continue the idea of supplication and worship, and taking inspiration from the large carvings that you see in Egyptian architecture, I created these carvings of what may be slaves kneeling in worship that I could then attach to the sides of this Stargate, impressing even more the idea that you have to bow down in worship to these beings that created this portal. One of the very great benefits of EVA foam is the ability to be able to carve into it very easily with heat tools, be that a soldering iron or pyrography machine. But the one very important factor to remember when doing so is to wear a mask, because the fumes from EVA foam are not very pleasant. So please wear a mask. And finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I was able to start painting. Just to say, I first of all have sealed both base and gate entirely in PVA, so it's got a really good, rigid, stable surface now for me to work with. So I wanted to paint the base in something that was going to give me a little bit of texture to get that kind of sandstone feel. I wanted it to feel like it was carved from a single block, not made up of individual blocks. So for that, I'm using acrylic caulk, slightly thinned down with a little water, and I also added a yellow ochre type colour. This was actually a metallic gold that worked out okay, but it didn't provide anything more than what a yellow ochre would have provided. So just something that's a sort of brownish, muddy colour. And so here I'm also adding a burnt umber just to dirty it down a little. I didn't want to start with the brightest of colours. So this will provide a good underlying dark, warmish base colour to work with. And to add a little fine grained texture, I also added bicarbonate of soda into the mix. This was given a pretty liberal application to the whole of the base structure. I wanted to use a fairly heavy coating to try and seal some of the gaps. Once that was thoroughly dry, I then gave it a full coat of acrylic paint that was a mix of yellow ochre, burnt umber and cad yellow. This base colour was then lightened a little with white, and the whole structure given a fairly liberal dry brush before moving on to the next coat. The final coat was a yellow ochre that was lightened with white, and again just a dry brush to highlight edges, pull out details, and some of that lovely grain that had come from using the bicarbonate of soda. With the base done, I was able to swap over and start painting the Stargate itself. First thing I needed to do though was mask out those areas where the crystals would be. That was easily done with just a piece of painter's tape and a sharp knife to mask them out. So once they were all masked out, the whole piece was given a base coat of grey primer and followed by a coat of metallic silver, all done with spray cans. I mixed using acrylic paint, burnt umber and a cad red to give myself a warm, dirty brown mix, and this was quite well thinned, although it did still have quite a reasonable amount of pigment in it, and the whole piece was just given a very mucky coating of that, followed same process but with a cerulean blue mixed with a little Payne's grey. I wanted the Stargate to have a kind of a bluish hint to it. I wanted the brown to give it a dirty feel. I allowed the brown layer to dry prior to painting the blue paint. The blue paint was then lightly dabbed back off so that I got this eventual mottled effect, like a blued metal effect. I then followed that with a dry brushing of chainmail. And once that was all dry, I then used a dark black with a little blue in it, but a dark black wash to just emphasize the separation between the inner revolving ring and the outer more static ring. I then finished off some of the detailing using a polished gold from Vallejo on the chevrons and the crystal casings. I also went on to give the actual crystals a coat with a thin acrylic orange ink. which unfortunately I don't have the footage for. Okay, this last piece is really experimental. I've cut the top off a Coke bottle, pop bottle, and remove this screw thread, the bit that the cap screws onto. And I also had some thin perspex from an earlier project, which I cut into a circle that would push fit into the open ring of the gate itself. I attached these two pieces together just using painter's tape, and then I hit that with the hot air gun to give a more organic form to the overall shape. Then using a light blue acrylic ink, I just coated all of the plastic parts on the inside and then glued these back together using hot melt gun, which just further added to some of the distortion of the plastic. Having coated the whole thing now in hot glue, I just pulled off some tendrils and some strands at the very far end, open end, that would give this residual final trailing off of the effect I was after, whatever that is.